Hello, and welcome to uPhilosopher. So, given that we're coming up on Christmas and that we've been spending time with the holiday season, I thought today would be a good day to talk about something kind of nice, Mr. Rogers. And there is currently a new film out about Mr. Rogers. It's called A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. I really enjoyed it. I cried a fair amount during it. It's a thoughtful film, and it's worth thinking about. And so, with that, I wanted to start with some criticisms that have been leveled at Mr. Rogers, who, by the way, no, was not like a Marine sniper or anything like that. He, in fact, to the best of my understanding, having never met the man, was really very much the person that is portrayed by him, right, in his show. In other words, someone who was very invested in other people, genuinely cared about the welfare of children, and was generally a kind and loving individual. So, in that way, fairly rare, in fact. So, well, what's the criticism? Well, one criticism came out of Fox and Friends, which I guess is kind of no surprise, which was this idea that Mr. Rogers somehow has destroyed generations of children, and specifically how? By making them feel special and therefore entitled. And so that's really interesting. So, of course, in Mr. Rogers' show, he ends each episode, right, reminding the viewer that there's no one like you. And in that way, right, you're special and loved and lovable. And so this criticism from Fox and Friends speaks to me of a whole lot of kind of flaws in our thinking societally. Uh, so what are those flaws? Well, one is kind of our ability to make something sound like a criticism that's based on care, when in fact it's a criticism based on selfishness and manipulation. What do I mean by that? So to say, well, like, isn't it concerning that making children feel special also makes them feel entitled? And then that's why we have a generation of people who just are kind of thoughtless and uncaring and just think that they deserve things without work. And that sounds really reasonable, right? It sounds like a reasonable thing to level at Mr. Rogers if he's somehow responsible for this. But if you think about it, what's also embedded in this idea is one, that being special inherently therefore means being better than and deserving. But that's not, first of all, true. One of the things that seems really obvious to me about Mr. Rogers' show, and I think is probably obvious to the children who watch it, though not in words, but I think they tend to show often a great more deal of depth than we grant them credit for, which is a realization that if Mr. Rogers is speaking to every viewer, that he doesn't mean only you and you are the only one who matters. There's nothing about his suggestion that there's no one else like you that means that you are better than everyone else. In fact, since he's saying it to every viewer, there's this weird kind of realization that everyone is unique, but we're also not unique in that uniqueness. And so there's a uniting quality to that. There's a recognition of the importance of the other as well. He's saying that there's no one else like me, and oh wow, I guess that also means there's no one else like you, and therefore we can respect each other's humanity and be, pardon me, kind of connected in that idea. And so what seems very strange to me is that really what Roger seems to be gesturing towards is the fact that everyone is worthy of love, and not like just one individual, but everybody, and that you can feel good about yourself as you are without, and here's the kicker, having to do something. And that's where I think that kind of criticism is really pretty insidious, right? Is that really what Fox and Friends was saying is, shouldn't people have to do something to be special? And what that really ends up being kind of read as is, shouldn't you have to do something to be worthy of love, right? That if if somehow specialness is connected to this idea of being loved, which I think Rogers is kind of trying to gesture towards, right? You're all worthwhile. It's okay. I can love you as you are. But notice his form of love, particular being, I believe, a Presbyterian minister, didn't mean like, oh, I approve of everything you do, or that you can't do better, or that you can't continue to grow. It simply means that you, as you are someone who deserves love, which has really nothing to do with whether or not that person should do better or improve, or isn't doing something wrong at the time. It's that ability. And when you think about it, when you have a child who does something, whether say you have, they're 5, right, and they do something either you know that they shouldn't do, or something kind of heinous, which children are wont to do, right? You generally don't tell that child, well, I'm not going to love you if you keep acting like that. No, really, I mean, the most effective thing for their behavior really ends up to be to remind them, like, yes, I am criticizing you and I want you to change your behavior, but I do love you. I love you no matter what. The problem isn't you, the problem is your behavior. And so what this criticism, which is really, if you think about it, kind of a capitalist criticism, is that no, I'm not going to love you if you don't do what I want, right? You're not worthy of love if you don't provide what society wants. And especially because that criticism connected it to the idea of work, this idea of like, well, don't people need to do something? And that's very kind of key in our society today, that people need to be productive citizens. They need to do something of worth. And we generally don't even mean like to do good. We mean you need to work, right? You need to produce, which is really just a way of saying you need to do stuff for us. It's all part of a kind of exchange, right? You're worthy of love when you do something for me. And so I think that that kind of criticism of Rogers is really very revealing, kind of about who we are, societally speaking, which is a society that believes in the idea of exchange. And really, that need to get something for something is undermined by Rogers, and interestingly enough, is undermined really by the core tenets of Christianity. Which is funny because certainly like a show like Fox and Friends would claim to be like, somehow Christian embedded. But the idea of love being self-sacrificial, that you don't need anything back, that a true gift is one that doesn't get anything in return, and that is fundamentally the nature of love, to be giving without expectation of return, seems to be one that doesn't function well in an economy that demands exchange, right? There are those who seem to be kind of suggesting or gesturing towards, through this kind of criticism, that almost that people like Mr. Rogers and charity in general, whether it's emotional charity or financial charity, are kind of a danger to the underlying economic system, which was really kind of what they were saying, insofar as they're saying like it's ruined a generation, right? It spoiled a generation of people. Insofar as, well, now you have a group of people who don't feel like they have to go out and work and toil to be worthy of love. Like they're basically okay with who they are as they are. And that really rattles the economic notion that gets us out there working more than we have to. Because if we're really honest with ourselves, the vast majority of us work way more than we have to, not just to have more than we need, that's true, but also because, and I don't know about you, but I certainly have this feeling, but also because there is this problem of like, but I need to be worthy, right? Don't I need to make more money and need to be able to kind of show off my job title? And even though the thing that would maybe make me happiest would be like kind of, working a little bit, playing video games, hanging out with my partner, playing with my kids, that we end up feeling like we somehow have to be worthy of it. And the only way to be worthy is by work, by doing this other stuff. And so it's interesting because it kind of connects nicely with the film, because the film was really about forgiveness and dealing with this issue of how do you forgive other people. And it's really important to note that forgiveness, by definition, is kind of an anti U.S. model of economy notion. And what do I mean by that? Well, the etymology of forgiveness means kind of a couple of things, right? The origin of the word kind of means to give up, right? Like to give something up, to give up on someone owing something to you. And it kind of seems to also mean like to give completely. And so the word forgiveness at its core, and certainly I think you see this when we talk about forgiveness in its fullness. Forgiveness basically means to give up on the idea of retribution and to give up on the idea that you're owed something. Well, that is a notion that doesn't fit very well with our economic notion that if you're going to get something, you have to give something, and if you give something, you should get something. But forgiveness is a full gift, right? It is a gift that doesn't allow for anything in return, right? Someone does you a harm, and instead of taking retribution or continuing to hold on to whatever anger or malice or vengeance we want to engage in, we say, I forgive you. And what's embedded in that idea is I am not going to seek retribution. But notice that that retribution is wholly justified, right? If someone does me a harm, arguably, particularly from our societal perspective, someone does me a harm, I have every right to retribution. I have every right to demand something of that person. And even if it's not in a vengeance kind of way, you've done me harm, therefore you owe me this. You need to pay me back for the thing that you stole, or you've done me an emotional harm, and therefore you have to be kinder or more sensitive. But forgiveness, kind of with a wave of a hand, suggests I give up, I give completely on the idea that you owe me anything. And so that is a significant gift, because there is no way for then the person to earn forgiveness. Forgiveness by definition can't be earned. There's no exchange involved. The person does a harm, and what do you give them? You give them basically the I'm not going to do you harm in return. And so there's a whole lot of things that people might want to criticize about that, particularly in our own society. One, it undermines our economic notion in general that people have to earn stuff. But it also, there's this worry of like, well, wait, if I forgive people, doesn't that mean that I'm saying it's okay for them to continue doing this harm to me? And I think from a perspective like Mr. Rogers, the answer is pretty clearly no. And well, why? Why do I say that? Well, it really connects back to a lot of kind of Christian ideas, but that go kind of like way back, which is most fundamentally, to be brief, the idea that forgiving other people doesn't require doing them harm, but does also require that they recognize your own humanity. And I don't mean in exchange, because then I think we're undermining the whole argument, but that we also, when forgiving other people, should be recognizing their humanity and our own, right? Recognizing their worth and our worth. So a good example of that is the whole idea of turn the other cheek, which funnily in a lot of ways is really kind of ignored by us today, especially because when we hear this narrative of like, okay, so we're told that if someone strikes us, right, we're supposed to turn the other cheek. Well, that just seems like, oh, okay, well, just go ahead, hit me as much as you want. And so it's kind of like this viewed as a real extreme. But what's interesting about it is that narrative goes all the way back to a time when you could strike people in different ways. And that if you struck them with the palm of your hand, you were striking someone as your equal. If you backhanded them, that's the way you would strike someone who was lesser than you, or a slave or something like that. And so the whole idea of turning the other cheek is really quite brilliant, because what it suggests is that if someone strikes you, presumably they're also demeaning you, right? They're striking you with the back of their hand, right? They're viewing you as less than them by virtue of the harm that they're doing, also keeping in mind that we're using metaphors here. They strike you with the back of their hand. If you turn the other cheek, at least metaphorically speaking, that places them in the position where if they want to strike you again, they can't backhand you. They're going to have to strike you with the palm of their hand. And of course, I know that there's lots of can't they just strike you with the other hand? But it's also metaphorical. That the idea being that if someone is going to demean you in this way, that the solution is not to demean them in the same way. This just creates a cycle of vengeance and violence. And moreover, it's a little bit strange that when someone hits us, we hit them back without really reflecting on the fact that our answer to why we're hitting them is because they hit us. Why did you hit Susie? You say to your children, why did you hit Susie? And the child says, well, because Susie hit me. And what's interesting about that is the reasonable response is I know she hit you. And I know you hit her because she hit you, but I'm asking you, why did you hit her because she hit you? And we just kind of already have in mind this idea that, oh, well, if someone hits me, they deserve to be struck back. But why? And the answer ends up having to be, well, but because they hit me. But if hitting people, if hitting you is wrong, because hitting people is wrong, well, then you've engaged in the behavior that you literally just said the other person shouldn't do. And the only way out of it is to go, well, yeah, but I didn't deserve it, but they deserve it. But why do they deserve it? Because they did it to me. Well, why didn't you deserve it? Well, because I didn't do anything to them. But it's highly likely that if Susie hits you, Susie's hitting you because she thinks you did something to deserve it. Maybe you didn't hit her, but you said something or you did something unkind. And so she's going to be like, no, I hit you because you did this, right? And, well, you might say, well, I did that because, and it just kind of cycles around. So the issue of forgiveness then is really, really quite fascinating because it's a gift that doesn't allow for anything to be given back, right? It's basically a gift of death, right? It is a gift of total self-sacrifice, right? You give up any right or claim that you have that someone should have to pay you back for the harm that they've done, right? You have sacrificed yourself. So it is therefore, by definition, forgiveness is an act of love, right? If the purest act of love is when you're willing to give of yourself, right? To sacrifice yourself, then forgiveness by definition is always an act of self-sacrifice. Right? Giving up what one is owed, giving up one's right kind of to existence in a certain sense, and therefore is a self-sacrificial act of love. And well, that seems to ask an awful lot of us. I mean, but that's not news. I don't think that's news to any one of us, and I think that's part of why there's occasionally the desire to criticize someone like Mr. Rogers, because that demand is so high. Right? The demand to love other people in a way that's self-sacrificial is such a high demand. It's such a significant demand that it kind of seems like too much. Are you saying, well, like if someone does me harm, I should be willing to let them do that harm? Well, again, it's important to recognize the whole idea of turning the other cheek, which isn't I just let them do the harm. The harm's been done. But that doesn't mean I have to reciprocate the harm and therefore demean myself and demean the humanity of the other, right? The solution would seem to be to turn the other cheek, meaning to say, no, I exist as someone who's worthwhile and you exist as someone who is worthwhile. And so we shouldn't continue on this particular path. So there's a lot of other stuff to be said here. But to be brief, I think the whole notion kind of comes into tension with our issues kind of masculinity and what our expectations of men are, and the criticisms that we kind of have that Mr. Rogers is making people weak, right? That the idea of forgiveness and allowing ourselves to love people to the point of self-sacrifice is somehow a weakness as opposed to a tremendous strength. It's really easy to strike back at people who strike at us. There's nothing hard or difficult about that, right? That's the natural self-defense mechanism. That's a natural kind of Darwinian gesture, right? Someone harms me, so I harm them back. There's nothing difficult about that at all, right? The only difficult thing, I guess, would be like if you take the time to really plan how to really destroy their lives. The difficult thing is not to do that, and that, by my lights, therefore, that is the thing that takes real strength and real strength of character. Strength of character doesn't seem to me to be defined by how we treat the people who are kind to us. Strength of character is defined by how we treat people who are cruel to us. It's easy to be nice to people who are nice to us. That's a natural Darwinian survival thing. Someone's kind to you, be kind to them, so they'll continue being kind to you, so you can continue to survive. That takes nothing. That's like an innate behavioral knee-jerk reaction. What's hard, what takes strength of character. Strength of character literally means to be strong enough to combat those things in ourselves that bend or move us in a particular direction. But I have the strength of character. I have the strength of will to move in the direction that I see as actually being most morally responsible. Takes much more strength of character to be kind to people who are not kind to us, because that is literally the opposite of our kind of natural biological inclination. Someone does me harm, to maintain my survival, I should do them harm back so that I can continue to survive. So you have to actually like physically stop yourself in order to make it so that you don't do that harm. So I think there's a lot there. There's a lot more to Mr. Rogers, I think, than just kind of like a cute, and to some people they think is like a creepy, like with little puppets and stuff, kid show. The idea instead that Mr. Rogers had, and people can criticize the filmography or the dialogue or the fact that the puppets' mouths didn't move and stuff like that. He wasn't trying to entertain children so much as he was trying to provide them with the belief that there was someone who cared enough to listen, which I don't think is something that changes at any point for any of us, whether we're children or we're adults. It's really important to us to be heard. The very idea that someone is willing to take the time to hear us and to recognize us as existing and to recognize our suffering and unique pains. This is always something that I found really profound, which is that we all have our unique pains. Every single one of us goes through what we go through. And yet that's the one thing that everybody shares, is the fact that we suffer. There's no guarantee that any single person on the planet is going to experience happiness or pleasure. But it's a guarantee that we all will suffer. So that's a uniting human condition, that experience, and that's something that we can recognize in the other and have compassion and empathy for. And it's interesting because I think in some ways Mr. Rogers' ending song, right at the very end of his show, would gesture towards that. He would sing, "It's such a good feeling to know you're alive. It's such a happy feeling you're growing inside. And when you wake up every day," and it continues on and on. It's really, really easy to hear the lyrics, and sensibly so, of that song. It's such a good feeling to know you're alive, which means to know that I'm alive, right? It's such a good feeling for me to know that I'm alive. It's such a happy feeling. I'm growing inside, and when I wake up every day, it can be a bright new, snappy day, so on and so forth. But there's also a way in which that song can be read in terms of it's such a good feeling to know that you're alive. And given the overall message of Mr. Rogers' show, I think that ends up being kind of a key possibility too, right? That the word "you" can both mean me and you, strangely enough. That when I'm singing that song, I can be singing about myself. It's such a good feeling to know that I'm alive. But it's also such a good feeling to know that you're alive. And that gesture towards your worth. It's good to know that you're there. And that I think is really kind of the key to kind of unlocking what's really kind of beautiful, or one of the things that's pretty beautiful and wonderful about Mr. Rogers and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, is that when he's singing about being alive, that part of what brings him great joy about being alive is the fact that he is happy that you're alive, happy that we were and are, and that the idea of having a human experience is not about what I do or what I make or what I accomplish and what I do that makes me somehow worthy of finally of recognition. But instead of being present and being someone who I can hear and someone who I would like to hear and someone with a unique and worthwhile story. So for my part, as the holidays continue, I want to say I'm glad to know that all of you are out there. And by my lights, not because you're listening to this right now or have managed to make it to the end of a 25-minute YouTube video, by my lights, the world is a more interesting place because you're in it. And so thank you for taking your time to hang out with me today, and I hope you have wonderful holidays. Have a wonderful week.